recognized by our accrediting body. It's not a test that I've produced in-house. I have to come up with my conclusions, and then my conclusions are turned over to the accrediting or to the testing, proficiency testing provider to see if I've gotten the correct answer.
And do you also have continuing education requirements, sir?
Yes, as part of our accreditation, I have to complete 8 hours of continuing education annually.
Is that a minimum standard, sir?
Yes, that would be.
Do you also have quality assurance manuals and protocols as related to the FBI laboratory?
Yeah, the way our structure for our quality assurance, we have laboratory manuals that apply to the whole laboratory as a whole. And then when you drill down to my unit, the Firearms and Toolmarks unit, we have specific quality manuals that address our procedures and our operations.
And not only being familiar, but have you actually taken a role in producing some of these standard procedures for the FBI lab?
Part of my role as the technical leader is I have to annually review them to make sure that nothing has changed within the discipline that would require a change in our SOPs. To include, I have written some of the SOPs that we have in place. I've written one for shooting reconstruction as well as for uncertainty of measurement.
And when you say SOP, you're talking about a standard operating procedure, sir?
That is correct.
And you talked about some of your membership in professional organizations. If you talk about just how maybe the organization is structured, like the AFTE, and the importance of that organization.
AFTE, that is my professional organization for firearms and tool marks examiners. And this is international. We have people that come in annually for our conference from all over the world, and they're specifically qualified examiners, either in firearms and or tool mark identification. There, it's a professional meeting. People present research projects that they've been working on. There are also business meetings as well, how the actual entity operates. So our meeting's coming up here in a couple months, and it lasts a week long. And there are a host of different topics that you can actually go and get information on.
And you previously mentioned OSAC, the Organization of Scientific Area Committees. Are you a member, not only a member of OSAC, but also a member of a specific committee with OSAC?
I am.
And what is that, sir?
You have to back up trying to answer that question. The OSAC actually came out of the National Forensic Commission that was developed in 2013 by the Department of Justice. And what the Department of Justice was attempting to do was to bring in professionals both in disciplines like mine, but also from universities and statisticians, to bring them together to help produce the best practices and standards for forensic science practitioners, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector. So in the end, we'll be generating documents that are standards that now we can apply to an accreditation. So if a laboratory is not following a particular standard, they would get flagged that they're not compliant. So that's the goal and the hope of the OSAC. The OSAC is actually a genesis from the National Commission of Forensic Sciences. So the committee that I actually sit on looks at firearms and tool mark identification. We have other committees that look at crime scene reconstruction, death investigation, latent prints, a whole host of forensic disciplines.
And I know that you said that you had taught at university, but do you also teach within the FBI, sir?
Yeah, the FBI has provided classes over the years for state and local, as well as international law enforcement agencies. Initially, I taught the scientific techniques in firearms and tool mark identification. I also teach the shooting reconstruction course that we provide at the FBI.
How long have you taught that shooting reconstruction course for the FBI, sir?
Well over 10 years.
In addition to teaching for American law enforcement agencies, have you also taught outside of the country to international police forces?
Yeah, I've been fortunate to teach both to the Israeli Police Department as well as the Irish.
And with dealing with your curriculum in shooting incident reconstructions in your teaching, do you specifically also focus on projectiles that are shot into wood?
Yeah. For our course, for shooting reconstruction, if you were participating in it, the way it's designed is it starts off very simple measurement problems. And it's going to culminate, getting more difficult as we go further along into the class. and it ends up with a hard object such as a car that's been shot, which is very difficult to do a reconstruction on. But along the way, we give a practical that deals with shooting into wood. And basically, all the participants get a block of 4x4 wood that has a bullet hole in it, and it has two purposes. Can the person actually retrieve the bullet out of the wood intact without destroying it? Plus, they also get to learn that the bullet, although it may go in one particular fashion, as it traverses the wood, it can change direction. So it may look like it's going in one direction, but because of the wood grain, it forces the bullet in a different direction.
And so let's get to your specific job as a forensic examiner with the FBI. And what is the nature of your work on a day-to-day basis with the FBI as a forensic examiner?
Typically, I receive evidence, and it's mostly firearms related. And if it's a firearm in the particular case, we're going to open it up, take notes on the item. If it's a firearm, we're going to check it for safety and functionality first before we actually handle it. If it's a firearm, we're going to test fire it. I need to know that it operates properly. And if you were in my laboratory, we have a facility that basically has a large water tank in it. It's basically about 10 feet long, stands about 4 feet high, and it's about 4 feet wide. And basically, I walk up to that tank with the firearm, and I shoot into it. That serves two purposes. I get to see that the gun works, plus it's going to slow the bullet down fast. And it's going to protect the bullet and keep all the individual characteristics intact that I can use for comparison purposes later.
Going through your career, approximately how many firearms and tools have you analyzed throughout your career? And a very just general estimate.
It's in the thousands.
How many trajectories have you developed during your career?
I've been on numerous scenes, well over 30 trajectory scenes.
And have you ever testified as an expert before?
Yes, I have.
How many times?
Approximately 45 times.
You've been talking about tool marks. Can you explain to the jury what a tool mark is, specifically in the field of firearms, and how it's made?
A firearm is really just an assembly of different tools. In my world, I just think of it as a tool. But there are two components that are coming out of the firearm that I'm considering. One's the bullet, and the other one's the cartridge case. But to go back to your original question, what is a tool? That is just the translation of a harder object coming in contact with a softer object, and the transfer of characteristics from one to the other. So for a bullet, if it's going down a barrel, well, when the bullet does go down the barrel, if we were looking at the barrel and we look down the inside of it, it has spiral grooves in it, and they're there for a purpose. If the bullet didn't have those grooves there, it wouldn't fly accurately. So the manufacturer decides how many they're going to put inside a particular barrel. And so when that bullet goes down the barrel, they're now imparted onto the bullet. We call that the rifling. We can see that. That's one of the characteristics, and that would be a tool mark, as well as the individual characteristics. Now, the cartridge case, that's also still contained in the firearm, and it's going to be extracted and ejected, but it's going to come in contact with several different tools in the firearm, one being the firing pin impression, as well as tool marks on the breech face. And then the extractor and ejector will also leave marks behind, tool marks.
And through your analyzation of firearms, can you match guns to cartridge casings that are found potentially?
Yes, that is predominantly what we do. We're comparing things. So we're comparing the microscopic features that are left on both bullets and cartridge cases. And the decisions that we can make when we do this comparative analysis, we can either eliminate, or it's inconclusive, or we can identify them as well.
And also part of your potential results also then confer over to the analysis of a potential trajectory of a bullet prior to striking an object. Is that correct?
Well, I need it to strike an object. But in order to do the trajectory, I need more than one point of reference. So yes, as part of my analysis, I do evaluate trajectories.
And when you're doing any type of analysis and looking at your results and conclusions, are there certain limitations that are embedded within the examination?
There are. So our reports that we generate, we put both the methods and limitations to that analysis. I may not be here testifying, and a court or a jury may have to understand what went into my analysis. So we put those methods and limitations right into our report.
And so the manner in which the examinations are conducted is laid out in the report,
That's correct.
and also any limitations associated with the examination and how that affected results laid out in your report.
That is correct.
And what's the importance of having that report?
Well, the report conveys the information about my analysis, my results. But it also has the methods and limitations so that if I'm not here to describe the methods and limitations, they're memorialized in a report.
And now, during your process of analyzing firearms and really in figuring out trajectories, do you also rely on the assistance of really a team of people that you work with in the FBI lab?
That is correct.
And do you have a name for your team?
Well, within my unit, I have technicians that assist me with collecting notes, not much different than I did when I started. And then they also assist me when I go on a shooting reconstruction as well. And then within our laboratory, we have what's called a laboratory shooting reconstruction team. And it's made up of different components within the FBI lab. There's our unit, which is the Firearms and Tool Marks unit. And our role is to basically be the lead examiner to try to figure out the reconstruction. We have our operational projects unit, which is going to bring along all the equipment for measuring. Today we have scanners and total stations, which will accurately record the information of the scene. And then we also go along with our evidence response team. These are going to be field agents that are going to assist us with the collection of evidence.
You also have units that provide graphics to you and do scans of objects and x-rays so you can see inside objects whenever you're determining trajectories in your analysis.
Right, so we also have our chemistry unit that has x-ray equipment that we can use and utilize in analysis.
And you'd mentioned having agents from the field and conducting total station scans at that time and providing information to you. How do you limit some of the information that you may receive from those field agents and the manner in which you actually conduct your analysis?
There are two things. If we're responding to a shooting reconstruction, in our unit, we already segregate the examiner that's going to go and actually do the scene versus the examiner back at the lab that's going to look at the evidence. We want the examiner at the laboratory not to have any idea of what the scene had to offer. So they're kind of kept separate from the scene information. When I go onto a scene, I don't use information from the scene, be it an agent's idea of what they believe happened. I basically collect the information and use that to form my analysis from the reconstruction.
And so this contextual information that you can get from members of law enforcement and special agents, is it important to keep that separate, especially during the initial phases of your analysis, so that you're just focused on the physical evidence on the scene?
It's very important, actually. Reason being is there's a lot of information that's coming in for people on the ground, and they'll be looking at different artifacts that may or may not have anything to do with the trajectory, and they may give credence to something that has no value at all or overstate its importance. Those are things that I don't need to know. I just want to look at the artifacts of the bullet's impact, measure them, and come up with my own conclusions.
And so an artifact, is that like a piece of evidence?
It can be a piece of evidence, a bullet hole, a bullet impact.
A gun?
A gun, yes, that's correct.
And so that may not be something that you consider when performing your analysis, specifically with trajectory initially.
That's correct. Typically, the guns aren't going to be there when I get there. I'm in Virginia. I'm going all over the country. By the time I get there, that evidence is usually gone, which is nice. I'm just looking at the room or exterior, and I'm actually looking at artifacts as far as bullets and impacts.
And did you analyze evidence submitted to you, in this case, FBI case number 282MM6740884?
I did.
Was that in reference to the officer involved shooting death of Corey Jones?
That is correct.
And did you follow these FBI standard operating procedures and protocols in the performance of your analysis of the evidence submitted to you in this case?
I did.
What two requests were made of you for you to perform, sir?
First request was to look at a log for a trajectory. And the second request was to analyze a gun for ejection pattern test.
And did you have administrative and technical review process completed for each of these analyses?
I did. Can I explain that?
Yes, please. I was going to ask you, what's that review process and the purpose of it?
I can't just generate a report and send it out. It has to go through a review process, and there are two levels. First is the technical review. So all the products that I produce are turned over to another examiner, and they review it for accuracy. There could be a return if they find something incorrect or they have a question about something, and then I have to make the correction. And then if it goes through the technical review, then it goes through an administrative review to make sure that the readability of the report is correct, and then it's issued.
And you did that during both processes that you completed for this case, is that correct?
That is correct.
And did you prepare reports of your findings for each of these, sir?
I did.
Okay. Let's start with your report dated June 28th of 2016 as it relates to the ejection pattern test. And what was the purpose of this test, sir?
There was a pistol sent in, and we're talking about ejection pattern. When we're talking about a semi-automatic weapon, that is one where there's a single chamber for each cartridge. So after you shoot, you need to extract the cartridge case, clear the chamber so another cartridge can be put in place. Well, in that extraction and ejection, the cartridge case is flung out of the firearm. So in this analysis, they wanted me to look at this pistol and evaluate where would these cartridge cases land in relationship to the firearm.
And when you determine where it would land in relation to the firearm, does that then begin to potentially give you an idea of general areas of where the gun was located when those casings were ejected from it?
Right, so this is a rough estimate on where the gun might be, because there are a lot of variables which I don't know in relationship to the shooting. It's just talking about the performance of this firearm and how the cartridge cases are extracted and ejected.
And did you provide me with just a video of an actual semi-automatic firearm being shot and a casing being ejected from it?
I did.
All right, let's go ahead and play that. And so this will show the firearm actually having the firing pin strike the cartridge and then seeing the casing get ejected. Is that correct?
That's correct. Your Honor,
Yes, sir.
is it possible that I could approach that to point out things on the firearm?
If you do me a favor,
Take a mic?
watch your step.
All right.
Just watch your step, and then we'll see how loud you sound. And if you need a microphone, there's one over by that podium plugged in, Dunk. Terrific.
Here is a laser pointer if you'd like to do that. Just push that red button right there, sir. And just be mindful of where the jurors are seated to make sure that we don't block their view, sir.
All right, this is a Glock pistol, and I'm going to point out a few things about this pistol so you have an understanding. I've said a lot of terms, and they'll have more context now. This is the frame, this green portion here. This black portion is called the slide. This is the actual barrel that you see right here. It's inside. You can't see the complete barrel because the slide is covering it. This is the extractor. That's one small little tool right there. It's going to grab the extractor groove of the cartridge case to pull it out of the chamber. And that's it. Sir? So you can see the gun recoiled. The shooter, the hand went back. That was from the discharge of the cartridge. For my benefit, you can see the cartridge case comes up and it comes back. It also hit the slide a little bit. Pause it right there, please. So when it was being pulled out, it started to come up and out. It hit right here on the back side of the slide, but it continued in a rearward fashion.
And so does each firearm, both, different manufacturers, different models within the manufacturer, can they actually eject that casing in different manners?
They can. In this particular firearm, this is what's called a short recoil operated firearm. And what happened is the barrel and the slide moved very small amount. The barrel and the slide had to stay together before the bullet left. And once the bullet leaves, they move a short distance, and actually the barrel dropped just a little bit, and that let the slide go. That's what unlocks the system and lets the slide go rearward. So in this particular system, it's a short recoil, and it has a dropping breech. Not all systems are this way, and they may eject differently as well.
So let's explain how you perform this test to look at the ejection pattern from a particular firearm, sir.
First thing is I have to set up a measuring platform, basically, on the ground. We call it a Cartesian plane. That lets me measure the X and Y value on where that cartridge case is going to land on the ground.
And so when we talk about X and Y, obviously you
Right.
deal with math all the time, but we're basically setting up like two lines that intersect, putting it on the ground, and then you have quadrants, or 4 different sections
That's correct.
that are sitting there. One of these lines is called the X, the other one's the Y.
That's correct.
Horizontal is the X, the vertical is the Y.
That is correct.
So you got 4 areas that you're looking for. Right in the middle where those lines intersect, what are you putting there?
So right over top of the cross the axis is the ejection port. I want the ejection port to be directly over top of the X and the Y. That's basically 0.
Okay, and what else are you doing when you're setting up to perform this test, sir?
I have to make sure it's square. I can't just put 2 measuring tapes down on the ground. I have to make sure that they're perpendicular to one another, so I check that. And then I need another person. I have to have a spotter. But additionally, in this situation, you can see the pistol is resting on a gun rest. I have to do the same thing, because I have to make sure that the pistol stays in the same position. If I shoot here or I shoot over here, if I keep moving the pistol, that's going to change or that's going to add more error to the measurement. So I'll put a tripod stand and put the pistol right on top of it. I don't move during the shooting process, but the spotter is going to mark where the cartridge case hits the ground.
And so through performing the test this way, is this the way you always do it?
That is correct.
And does this take out the number of variables that may affect what the ultimate results are?
It's trying to reduce the number of variables. It's not going to take them all out, but it's going to reduce them.
And did you also provide a little bit of a PowerPoint just to show as a demonstration what you mean when you set up this Cartesian grid, and then also the manner in which the test is performed?
That's correct. I provided this.
And so what we're looking at right here is basically as you described, sir?
That is correct.
And would this be consistent to what you did in this case?
It's the same, but I did it outdoors instead of indoors.
And so you have a tripod with a stable firing basis,
That's correct.
a directionality so that I take it you're shooting for a target to make sure that you're shooting,
That target just happened to be there. I wasn't shooting at that target.
shooting in the same direction.
That's correct.
You have your Cartesian graph with your X and your Y and your 4 sections here so that you can have it marked. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so what we're seeing here is just the progression of the test. Is that correct?
That's correct. So on the left photograph, you can see that I'm holding the pistol, and then the spotter is making sure that the ejection port is over the cross. That's 0, 0 for the measurement. And then the spotter moves to the back to watch where the cartridge case actually hits the ground.
Okay.
This actually represents, measuring where the cartridge case hit off of the plane. So you can see the X runs from left to right, and then Y would run top to bottom. So where those two intersect is where one of the cartridge cases would have been measured from where it hit the ground.
And so by looking at it in this format, you can then determine how far either behind or to the front of the ejection port that the casing landed, and then how far either to the right or to the left that the casing landed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that part of your findings and conclusions whenever you place them in your written report?
Yes. One thing I should point out is that I do it in several different positions.
And we'll get to that. What are we looking at here, sir?
I wanted to kind of give you an idea about kind of an introduction to the uncertainty of measurement. Because in my report, I'm going to give you a value. It may say 5 feet to the right, 5 feet back, but that's just the average of all my measurements. So I had to figure out the uncertainty. And what I'm doing with the uncertainty is trying to give the best result that would include any error. So if I did just a couple shots, I might be accurate, but I may not be precise, okay? Or it might be vice versa. I could be precise but not very accurate. So with our uncertainty of measurement, we're trying to hit that target on the left. Get all the data that we can that will establish both accuracy and precision. Not just a straightforward measurement, but basically a bracket around that measurement. And that's what I was trying to illustrate.
You're talking about the uncertainty of measurement. Explain what you mean by the uncertainty of measurement as it relates to the person that's measuring it and how they measure it, and why it's important to build in that error when you're looking at just measuring.
Even everything that we do to make a measurement has error. It could be the rulers, and most certainly it's the person that's making the measurement. I'm the biggest source of error. I can be as precise as I want reading that ruler, but I'm introducing error. So we're trying to encapsulate all those variables to give the most precise and accurate result with a value. This is called a Gaussian curve. So let's pretend the true, or like in the diagram, the actual known value is the black line, the perfect measurement, which we can't obtain. But all of my other measurements encompass it, okay? So if I figure out the uncertainty of measurement, I will hit that mark, okay? I may have measured everything at the red, but when I figure out the uncertainty, I will hit the true value.
And so regardless of a specific measurement at a single point in time, by the time that you include this error and create a range of measurement, then you are sure for like 98, 99% that the actual measurement will be within that range. Is that correct?
Right. So for our lab, we use 3 standard deviations. Typically, in most industry, you see 2 standard deviations, which is 95%. 95% of the value will be there. But we go out to 97, or 99.7. So we go out 3 standard deviations.
And sir, so when we talk about this ejection pattern test, you're talking about where the casing lands, not where it ends up, correct?
That's correct. It's where it strikes the ground.
Why do you do that?
Because we don't know the substrate, the ground, and all the variables exterior to the environment. We don't know those. So the truest thing that we can count for is where it strikes the ground.
And when you talk about the different variables of the ground, it's not just, is it pavement or asphalt or wood or something like that, is it?
That's true.
I mean, you have variables such as the grade of whatever it is, how rough it is, how smooth it is those variables also?
Right. Those are variables that we could not account for.
How about the slope? Whether it's something that's maybe at a decline like a ramp,
Sure.
something that maybe is wavy.
Those would always, the cartridge case, as you saw in the video, it comes out and it's spinning. And when it hits, depending on what the surface is, may eject even further out after it strikes the ground.
How about weather? Could be wet, could be dry, could have a lot of wind.
Sure.
Are those variables that could affect where the casing actually rolls to as opposed to just where it strikes?
This would also play a factor. To include, one thing that you have to consider is they're not, once they hit the ground and they stop, they don't stay there necessarily. If people are responding, first responders, they could run into them inadvertently and knock them about.
So people, animals,
Sure.
different foreign substances on the ground like oil or, any type of foreign gasoline, anything could affect how it would roll or how far it could potentially go after it strikes the ground. Is that correct?
I don't know about petroleum products, but the whole concept is we're trying to get the best measurement based on the performance of the gun. And these other variables, we cannot control the environment. So we don't introduce those variables into performance of the gun.
Intervening objects sometimes. If you're not on the scene, there could be a wall there could be a vehicle, something that would come, that would change the direction of the casing or stop it from moving further. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And so your focus is on where they land.
That's correct.
How many shots do you do with each shooting position, sir?
10 per position.
And what shooting positions do you fire the gun to document your results?
There are 3 different positions. So one is the standard shooting position if I was holding the pistol like I was shooting at a target. Then I also rotate it 90 degrees to the left, and I also, from standing, 90 degrees to the right. I don't know how the shooter was holding the gun, so I want to show what it would look like if they were holding it in these other positions.
Obviously, a standard shooting position where the ejection port is facing upward to the sky is going to be a standard, what people are trained with firing a gun. Is that correct?
Just like you saw in the video, that would be a standard shooting position.
And did you actually use the firearm that was used in this case to kill Corey Jones in completing your test for the ejection pattern?
I did.
And what firearm was used, sir?
This was a Glock pistol. It was 40 caliber, model 27.
And what was the serial number? And review to your notes if you need to, sir.
So the serial number for this pistol is EGM 509 US.
And use the same magazines from that weapon, sir?
Right. Part of our protocol is you have to use the same magazine
Why is that?
because the magazine has a spring in it, and that spring is pushing on the cartridges, and it can affect how the next cartridge is being delivered into the chamber, how quickly. So when that cartridge case is coming out, that next cartridge could come in contact with that cartridge case that's being ejected.
And do different folks sometimes keep a different amount of ammunition in their magazine sometimes so that that spring is not strained as much every single time, like maybe keeping one round out of the mag?
Sure, as you put more and more ammunition in, the spring gets compressed.
So the difference between a semi-automatic firearm and a revolver real quick, obviously here you're dealing with a semi-automatic firearm, correct?
That's correct.
And that would be a firearm that uses a magazine and then reloads each time after firing the shot once a cartridge is engaged into the barrel. Is that correct?
Right, so like in the video that you saw, there's one barrel and it has one chamber for a semi-automatic, as opposed to a revolver, which has a cylinder that rotates multiple chambers in line with the barrel.
And did you use the same type of ammunition or try to use it's close to the same type of ammunition that would have been used during the shooting?
I did. I contacted the local police department to find out what ammunition was collected. In this case, in this ejection pattern test, you have to use the same type of ammunition. Ammunition manufacturers use different proprietary powder, and it can burn and create different pressures. So you want to compare basically apples to apples. You don't want to use a different type of ammunition. You might get a different type of ejection pattern.
What kind of ammunition did you use, sir?
In this case, I believe it was Winchester 180 grain.
180
grain.
Yes, sir. And
Grain.
what is 180 grains, if you just explain that real quick?
Grain is a unit measure that we use in firearms. It's a very small unit of measure. Just to give it perspective, there's 7,000 grains in a pound. So the 180 grains refers to the weight of the bullet.
And same as the 40 Smith & Wesson caliber Winchester cartridges?
That's correct.
And you talked about the proprietary use of gunpowder and cartridges by manufacturers, and also potential differences in pressures depending on the difference in ammunition. Any changes in the results to this type of test, would that be very minimal, or would you expect it to have some type of real change?
I think it would be very minimal if I used a different type of brand of ammunition. It would be there'd be some difference, but it wouldn't be as great as the actual shooter's operation of the firearm. If you think back to the video, you saw the young lady's hand recoiled. If I hold the gun very loosely, too loose, and let the gun just kind of flow back, that impedes the recoil. And so it won't eject as well. So when you're holding it in standard position, holding the pistol firmly, it should eject properly. So I would expect very little change using different types of ammunition as opposed to the actual shooter's holding of the firearm.
And talking about the pressures and these things, are these some of the things that are built into those error rates whenever you're providing the results of the test and providing really a general number, not a specific number, but a general range of numbers?
Right, so the data that I collected speaks only to the Winchester ammunition that I tested and the error associated with it.
Talked about the ejection port on this firearm. It's located on the right-hand side. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Whether you fire it left-handed, right-handed, it's on the right-hand side. Is that correct?
If you're holding it in the standard position, it's always going to be on the right-hand side, whether you use your right hand or your left hand.
And the height of the firearm that you had during this testing, sir, what was the height and how did you come about that?
Let me check. So the approximate height that I set the pistol at is 55 inches. That was basically for me to hold the pistol straight out. That is a number that I chose based on my shooting position.
And you chose that as not based on, that is the exact height you know this gun was fired on October 18th of 2015, correct?
That's correct.
And is part of the variations in the height, is that something that's also built into these error rates that you have?
Well, it speaks to that height. It can't speak to how it would have performed at, let's say, 6 feet. As you change the position of the pistol, now you change the distance that the arc could go for the cartridge case.
And let's talk about the results of your test. So, when you are firing from a standard position, what would we expect that casing to land?
I would expect, using that pistol, that it would eject out to the right and to the back.
Okay. And what were your results as far as the amount of feet that we'd expect a casing to land out of this specific firearm to the right and to the rear?
Using the standard position, if I was going to shoot the firearm correctly, this is the average of all my results. So it struck the ground 9 feet to the right and 4.36 feet to the back. That's the average of all my results. Okay? But the other figure that you have to put into context is the uncertainty of all the tests that I took. So for the distance that it went to the right, you have a plus or minus 8 feet. And the distance that it went to the rear, you have a plus or minus of 5.88 feet. So think of that one mark, 9 feet to the right, 4 feet to the back, and now put a big curve around them with that uncertainty. All those cartridge cases should fall whenever I shoot it within that area.
So, and we're looking at approximately 9 feet to the right, 4.36 feet behind the shooter, behind the ejection port of the firearm.
That's correct.
To where a casing would land.
That's correct.
And so now we're getting a general understanding of where we could expect the shooter to be standing in relation to where we find groups of casings?
We have an understanding of where the firearm, how it performed. You have a rough idea where the person was standing.
And you also did the same examination with the palm down and the palm up, correct?
That's correct.
And just, so for the palm down, we actually, the ejection port's now facing to the left of the shooter, correct?
That's correct.
And so we would,
It's actually facing more up and to the left.
and so as expected, then we found results that the casing would land to the left, but also back to the rear, correct?
That's correct.
And then with the palm up, now the ejection port is more in a downward position.
That's correct.
We got, once again, to the right and to the rear.
Right, but now it's smaller because now the ejection port is now pointing towards the ground.
So actually, regardless of how exactly the firearm is being held, and even maybe the variations within holding that firearm to some degree, we still have an expectation that those casings are going to end up behind where the firearm was when it was fired.
Using this pistol and ammunition, it did go to the rear.
And your confidence level was 99.73%, is that correct?
I believe it's 99.7. 99.73, yes.
And I want to show some sketches. And sketch number 1, it's actually a different. And these have been introduced into evidence. Okay. 1 second, Your Honor.
Sure.
This is going to be stage 53A through D, Your Honor.
All right.
So we'll start off with scene sketch number 1.
Ow.
And so here we see a sketch of a scene, and we see a group of casings 1 through 3, where I have the pointer, and a group of casings 4 through 6. Do you see those, sir?
I do.
And seeing where these casings are located, and obviously we have a directional here pointing north, and if you have a shooter that is firing the casings that are labeled, that end up being labeled 1, 2, and 3, and you know that that shooter is firing to the northwest up this ramp, given what you know about the ejection pattern and where these casings are, would you expect the shooter to be farther northwest from this position of where these casings 1 through 3 are?
You got to remember the limitations here. If what we see here is true and accurate, this is exactly where the cartridge cases came to rest. Yes, I would expect, using this gun, that the shooter would be forward of each of those positions, just to the left of them.
So forward, and then to the left or to the west, if we want to be more specific.
West.
More to the southwest of each one of those casings.
That's correct.
And let's look at sketch number 2, sir. And so obviously this is from a different view, a little bit closer up, is that correct?
Yes, that looks similar.
And so now if somebody is firing the Glock 27 firearm that results in these casings 1, 2, and 3 right behind this SUV, once again, they're going to be firing to the northwest, and we expect them to be in front of those casings and then to the left or down here to the southwest. Is that correct?
I can't put the shooter exactly in any position here based on the ejection pattern. I don't know if the shooter's moving. Are they stepping forward, taking a shot each time? But if the shooter is static, not moving, and they are shooting in a one direction only, you would expect that they would shoot or end up in that position. If they're shooting to the north, you'd expect the cartridge cases to come out to the right and to the rear.
And back.
I said rear, back, yes.
So we're saying we're not even taking into account whether the ground is sloping up, which would cause the casings to even roll back even further, correct?
Right, I don't know anything about this particular scene, so I don't even know the terrain. So
We're talking about generalities of, you would expect the shooter to be in front and then to the left of the casings.
that's correct.
And then once again, when we're looking at casings 4, 5, and 6 that are located up here, if the shooter is shooting in a northwesterly direction, once again, from each one of these casings, we would expect the shooter to be forward to the northwest and then left to the southwest.
That's correct. If the person's not moving and they're static, you would expect those cartridge cases to fall in the same place.
And so, from the first round of casings right close to this SUV, if the shooter's firing north or northwest, then we expect the shooter to be further away from the SUV than where the casing is located, correct?
Can you repeat that?
Given what we just talked about, that the shooter would be further to the north or northwest and then over to the left, we would expect that where the gun is located, where the shooter would be located from the casing, the shooter would be further away from the SUV than where the casing is located.
I don't even know the scale of this diagram. I don't even have a context of where placard number, the first yellow one next to the SUV would be.
And so if you're looking at, let's say, casing 3 and the shooter is firing to the northwest, and we've already talked about how you expect the shooter to be in front of that casing and to the left, then obviously that shooter is going to be further, I say further away from the SUV, but is definitely not going to be closer to the SUV than the casing is.
Right. I wouldn't expect, if that placard, the one that's, the yellow one that's right behind that vehicle, if that's right on top of the vehicle, I wouldn't expect them to be right next to the vehicle. I'd expect them to be a little bit forward of the vehicle, and it would eject back. If they were close enough to the vehicle, it may have hit the vehicle and bounced forward, if it was within that range.
And so, as we look at these casings, it's not only that we have an expectation that the shooter is going to be further up in the direction that the shooter is firing, whether it's in the northwest, but also further to the left of where that shooter would be firing. So in this case, further closer to this guardrail. Would that be correct?
That would be correct.
And that's from your analysis of the exact same firearm, doing the standard shooting casing ejection pattern test that you always do, and finding out that position of where the casing landed with the built-in error that would be associated.
That's correct.
So let's look at your date report, March 9th of 2016, the shooting incident reconstruction, sir. And what was requested for this submission, sir?
I received a log, a large piece of wood, and I was asked to do a trajectory analysis.
And so are you trying to see the path that the bullet traveled that ended up striking this tree, sir?
That's correct. First, I don't even know if it is a trajectory. I just received a log, and they said, take a look at the log and see if there's a trajectory here.
And so we'll continue. When we discuss it, we'll talk about it as a log. Is that good?
That's fine.
Very good. And what pieces of items of evidence did you receive for this analysis, sir?
Actually, I just received a log. In the process of analysis, I found that there was a bullet in the log.
Did you also receive a bullet jacket from your Palm Beach sources? Did you receive that also, sir?
Yes, I did.
Were you able to make any type of conclusions based on that bullet jacket that really assisted you at all in determining a potential trajectory?
I didn't do any analysis on that because that was going to be for Palm Beach to look at. They had already started the examinations, so I was only looking at the reconstruction.
And now, as we talked about before, when discussing that contextual information that you can get from the scene sometimes that could affect the way you independently look at your analysis, did you have any personal knowledge at all regarding what the potential position of the shooter was when you performed your examination of that log?
I did not.
And does that go back to the exact same things that we discussed earlier about making sure that just that having that contextual information does not affect you at all in making your analysis?
Right, so now I'm just focused on this piece of wood and does it have a trajectory in it. At a later date, that information was then taken to see where it went back into a scene.
And does that help from having what would be called contextual bias?
It does. I think the term contextual bias means if I give you some information and I tell you this is the way that happens, I may take that information that you gave me and help build it into my analysis. So if I don't have that available, then you just get the blanket, here is the information that I can provide. I don't try to fit the information based on information given to me.
And you did perform an examination of the log, is that correct, sir?
That is correct.
And let's talk about your initial examination of the log. What did you do first with it?
I was surprised. It was a log, and it had a defect in it. But I wasn't sure if the defect was an actual bullet hole. And my first thought was to actually, and which I did, was to test it chemically. We have a little chemical test. It's a presumptive test to look for lead and copper residues that are left behind by a bullet impact. So I did that test first. And it did come back being positive for lead residue. The hole was very tight. And to be quite frank, if I had been on the scene and I was looking at this, I may not have been able to get the trajectory. Because the trajectory rod that I used to develop the trajectory wouldn't fit in the hole. And the reason being is, and this happens with wood, it also happens with plastic. The material actually, after the bullet goes through it, it closes back around the hole. It tries to retain its shape. So now a projectile went through it, but now everything's sealed back around it. So I couldn't get a trajectory rod in it. I didn't believe in the beginning that I was going to have any success with this log, trying to get a trajectory.
And so when you say trajectory rod, I mean, obviously it sounds pretty self-explanatory, but you talk about like a metal rod. You know, are they different diameters? Or are they pretty thin? And then you try to see if you can put it in there and see what it tells you.
Right. So in our trajectory kits, we have two types of rods, and they're basically based on caliber. One's a smaller caliber for around .223, and the other one's around 9mm caliber for a larger projectile. And they're basically, they can be aluminum, and ours are aluminum rods, and they're color-coded.
And so obviously, I say obviously, which one did you use for the purposes of considering?
I actually used the pink rod. It's smaller in diameter. I figured I'd have more success getting this into this hole, but it wasn't going to happen. And I knew by trying to force it, I would be introducing error into trying to probe and push it into this trajectory.
And so you looked at the entry point into that log. Mm-hmm. There was no exit point, I take it?
There was not.
And is this something, the damage around it, and you mentioned plastic, is this something common that you find with bullet defects into trees, sir?
I haven't examined many trees. I've seen a lot of wood, basically in houses.
And I guess I should refine my question better. Is this something that you find often with bullet defects into wood?
Yes, tightly bound wood, you can see this, yes.
Now, what other kinds of unique aspects do you see and that will affect in determining trajectory when a bullet is shot into wood?
Like I explained earlier, one of the practicals in our class is to give the investigator some idea of the complexity and limitations of wood. You know, the projectile comes in there, The projectile's spinning. We talked earlier about the bullet going down the barrel. The reason that the bullet spins is for stability. Just like a quarterback, when they throw a football, they want it to spin for better accuracy. So now this bullet or projectile, when it's approaching wood, it's spinning. And so when it hits and it meets resistance, it wants to keep turning to the direction that it was spinning. So it may drift if it's spinning to the right or if it's spinning to the left.
Are there other aspects of the wood itself that can affect the drifting of the bullet once it enters into the wood?
If a knot has formed in the wood, it's a more dense area of the tree, it's harder for the bullet to overcome. That'll also direct it differently.
And so since we're talking about density inside of a piece of wood, also there are different densities between different types of wood, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so whereas you get a denser piece of wood, you might potentially look for more drifting as associated with something that would be softer that wouldn't meet so much resistance to that projectile. Or is that way too general?
I don't know if I can answer that question, because that's, now you're talking about almost like a botanist and the density of wood. That would be outside my expertise. I really know about the bullets themselves and how they perform in wood and their tendencies, but I don't really know about different woods and their morphology.
And so when you see that, if you find a bullet inside a piece of wood, do you have to think about accounting for this drifting process that can occur when you're going back and trying to determine that trajectory?
Yes, you do. It would be one of the limitations or error.
And so the trajectory rod would not work. What was your next course of action?
I called our chemistry unit. Our chemistry unit has x-rays. I figured since I can't get a rod in here, I'm going to look for the bullet. I'd pretty much given up on the trajectory, so I wanted to find the bullet inside the log.
Did you have x-rays completed of the log, sir?
I did.
Scans completed of the log?
I did.
And then determined potential trajectories after all of your analysis of that, also, of all your work, and then put those into 2 visual graphics.
I did.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Showing what's marked as 84 composite A through L, state's evidence. And if you would, same ones, yes, sir.
Come.
Same ones that. I believe it's under stipulation, sir.
No problem. Jersey, okay? We'll take a break before cross starts and get some coffee and stretch.
Thank you. Approach again, sir. And you previously reviewed each one of these, sir, is that correct? And take your time looking through them.
I did. These are my notes, copies of some of my notes, and the graphics that were generated from them.
Asked to introduce is 84, Your Honor, under stipulation.
Admitted.
And put those into a presentation here, sir, so we can go through each one of them. I leave them up there with you so that you can also look at them. If you're more than welcome with the judges, okay, of course, to get down and do whatever you'd like, but if you can see there, that's fine too. So, for the first slide, what are we looking at here, sir?
This is the log that was x-rayed. So you can see the bullet, and there are 2 screws in there.
And those 2 screws or nails are used as markers to know that we're looking in between them in order to find this object that we're looking to see as a bullet.
I don't know if it was done for that purpose. I believe that those were for total station markers from the scene. So before it was removed, the total station operators shot those into the scene, so they knew how to put it back into the scene.
And when you're talking about total station, is that the data from the scene that marks different points within the scene of interest?
Objection, Judge.
basis? You may.
You mentioned total station, is that correct, sir?
That's correct.
What is total station?
Total station is an instrument that is used on our crime scenes to collect data points, basically measuring different objects within a scene.
And did you use data from total station into your expert opinions in this case?
At the end, the total station data from the 2 screws were used to put the log back into the scene. So yes, total station data was used to put, I didn't personally use it, but I know that total station data was used to put that log back into the scene.
Okay.
I'm sorry, you trailed off. I just didn't hear the last.
Could you just repeat your last?
Yeah, so I personally didn't use the total station data. The total station data that was collected from those was used to put it back into the scene.
So, next slide, sir. What are we looking at here, sir?
So now we saw the bullet before. So I asked for a more powerful scan of the log, and I could see something now. The white portion that you see right there is the bullet sitting in the log. But now you can see the turbulence behind it where the bullet traversed the wood. I can see the pathway of the bullet. And I can also see the entry in the bark of the bullet right there, the darker area on the bark. So that was great. I was surprised that I could see that. But we're only looking at one plane here. We're only looking at basically one side of it. So I asked for more segments to look at it from different planes to try to understand its three-dimensionality in the log.
Just so we know what parts of the log we're talking about, this is actually the bottom of the log here, and this is actually the top of the log here?
That's correct. It's upside down.
Gotcha. Okay.
Of course, you can see the log has been cut because one of the nails is missing from it. And now we're looking down through the log. And you can see the bullet is if you look at 12 o'clock, that appears to be the base of the bullet right there. So the bullet has turned from its entry. So it's no longer, when the bullet came through the tree, it's actually turned sideways. But you can see a kind of conical or a cone disruption of dark area leading back to the opening in the bark.
And this part of the wood right here, is this the knot?
That's really, that's just the center of the log, the core of the log. This is the other end. So if we're looking from the previous ones from top, now we're looking through on the other side.
Same type of entry and where it entered the log?
That's correct. And these are just more views of it from different planes. And you can see the turbulence of the wood where it's sealed back around the hole. Just another picture, another plane.
And do any of these scans show an indication of what we talked about earlier with any type of drifting of a projectile entering into a piece of wood?
Yeah, well, can we go back? Can we go back? One more. Let's try the next one. Yeah. Your Honor, could I get up?
Yes, you may. I scared you. Sorry.
Sorry.
Watch your step.
This is hard.
Please.
This is a Glock pistol. The rifling is rotating to the right. When the bullet leaves, it's spinning to the right. This is the entry. But if you see this darker line, and I'm trying to interpret where did that actual line of that bullet go, it appears that the bullet entered almost flat on, like this, in this direction, but it drifted a little bit to the right. So the bullet's spinning a little bit, and it's trying to turn and keep turning because it's slowing down, so it drifts just a little bit, just a small amount. Okay.
And did you also receive data from the scene which assisted in the ground truth, sir?
I didn't receive that. My other unit, operational projects unit that was working on the graphics, they received the ground truth on the data from the scene.
And did they provide you with those graphics which you then affixed trajectory and completed for them?
They did.
And so, did you then formulate a trajectory cone associated with this bullet hole in this log?
I did.
And is this one of the representations of that, sir?
That's correct.
So let's look at this one. We're looking from the side view. Is that correct?
That's correct. Can I explain something?
Please.
The trajectory is basically the connection of 2 points in space, typically drawn as a line. But bullets don't fly in a straight path. They actually arc. And the further the bullet has to travel, the more it starts to arc, because gravity and air resistance are taking over and the bullet's basically dropping back down to the earth. So that's one limitation. That's one error. But in this situation, when I developed the trajectory, what you're seeing with that green is a cone of air. Not much different than we did with the trajectory. I don't know the exact path of the bullet through the tree, and I also know that the bullet tended to drift a little bit. So I built an error around the trajectory, knowing that the bullet had to come within that cone. So I don't know exactly where that path is, but I know it should fall within that cone of error.
And this is from top down that we're looking, sir?
That's correct.
So once again, we see this is going to be the graphic of the actual bullet within the log, and then the entry point here being represented by the hole. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then the trajectory cone in green. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so the direction that the trajectory is headed is, there's a compass right here. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the trajectory cone is now headed in a southeasterly direction from where this tree originated, correct?
Right, so the trajectory originates from the southeast.
So you would expect that the firearm, saying the shooter necessarily, but the firearm that fired this bullet would be to the southeast of where this tree was.
That's correct. Along some line, that firearm existed. I don't know where on that line, but the line contained the firearm.
And let's talk about, you mentioned this cone and you talked about bullets traveling in an arc. Are there other general factors of error in any case that require the use of this cone for this, especially for this type of single trajectory?
Most certainly. If we have a situation where one of the trajectory points is damaged, imagine I have 2 holes, but one of them is very large. I have to take into account that that second hole, the bullet had to come through it, but I don't know where it came from. So we will create a cone to indicate within that pathway, we understand that the bullet traveled, but we don't know exactly where within that pathway.
And you talked about that the bullet is spinning from a gun. Is the bullet also tumbling as it travels from being fired?
It shouldn't tumble until it's really running out of basically velocity. You know, if we were going to shoot any particular gun a great distance, at the very end the bullet starts to lose its gyroscopic stability. It will start to tumble.
And is it also fair to say you don't know how exactly a person may be holding a gun, or obviously where the person or how the person is standing or positioned?
I don't know if the person was standing, sitting. I don't know. I can't figure that out based on the trajectory.
Don't know if the person's stationary or running?
Do not.
And are those some of the also pieces of contextual information that you refrain from putting into your trajectory analysis so that you're not biased in what you actually produce?
I had no knowledge about the shooting event in this case.
You also don't know about intervening objects between along the path in which the projectile could have crossed. Is that correct?
I don't.
What is unstable trajectory?
A good example would be a windshield that was shot. The bullet goes through the windshield. It may be a very small bullet, but it creates a large hole. And then it goes into a seat. I may not be able to get a nice connection between those two. It's not very stable. So I'm going to create some error around that so that I know that I am going to encapsulate where that bullet may have flown because of that larger hole that's in the windshield. That I would consider to be an unstable trajectory.
And also the fact that there is a single projectile in this case as opposed to multiple projectiles, does that affect the potential error that's associated with determining a trajectory?
Well, it doesn't affect the error with the trajectory. I can't tell you anything about the position of any particular shooter because it's just one straight line. I don't know where they are. What would be a situation where I have triangulation, where I have multiple trajectories that are all coming back to a particular spot, then I could extrapolate that that is an origin where somebody was standing and shooting.
And so since you have just a single bullet hole and projectile in this case, are you able to accurately state where this origin of the bullet would have came from?
No, typically in a situation such as this, you would use witness statements to have an understanding of how the scene or people were moving. And the trajectory gives information to support it or to refute it.
And so some of the specific factors in this case that required the use of this trajectory cone, what would some of those be, sir?
Excuse me?
What would some of the specific factors in this case that also required the use of a trajectory cone which has built-in error?
Primarily was the way the bullet traversed the tree. It started to drift. And I was concerned that if I tried to follow a straight line, I really was going to send the trajectory off course. So I used interpretation of how the bullet actually moved through the tree to create that error.
The fact that a tree is actually curved on its surface as opposed to being flat, does that affect anything to do with trajectory?
It would. If we backed up and I didn't have the luxury of having the inner details of this log, and all I could look at was just the circumference of the log, all I could say is it originated in this area outside of it. It's curved, as opposed to a flat surface, which would reduce the peripheral angle of the trajectory.
And then also the fact that the log was cut down from the tree on scene, does that affect your trajectory analysis?
It does. You have to take that into account, the error. The tree has been removed from the scene. It was cut. So although the screws were marked, so we know where they were in space, we can't, it's not like I did it on the scene in the best case scenario. Although I don't believe I would have been able to get this one on the scene without taking it back to the lab.
And so these necessarily result in a cone, trajectory cone, which encompasses as error as opposed to a distinct straight line. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so by creating this cone instead of a straight line, now we're appropriately accurate in determining the origin of the trajectory into space.
That's correct.
And so we know where the bullet likely came from, correct?
That's correct.
And how many degrees are associated with error in this trajectory cone?
3 degrees.
And so it's going to be 3 degrees and entirely to the face of the cone that will then direct out in a southeasterly direction. Is that correct?
Right, so as it radiates out, it keeps expanding.
And so as the distance increases away from this log, then obviously the position of the origination of that trajectory, or where the bullet came from, gets larger and larger. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And encompasses more and more potential points of where that bullet would have originated.
That's correct.
And so What's the industry standard when it comes to error built into trajectories?
There's no industry standard for what the error should be to a trajectory. There's research that's been done to evaluate how precise and accurate examiners can make these decisions. In one study done by Mike Haig, an examiner out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, he extrapolated that it was about a 5% error in the worst case scenario when an examiner actually tries to develop a trajectory.
And Mike Haig, is the Haig's father and son, are they the ones who write the books when it comes to trajectory analysis?
They've done quite a bit of work in this field.
Something that you use extensively in your research and also to assist you in analysis through the years?
Yeah, I've used Lucian Haig's shooting reconstruction book. It's also part of our training.
Is there any reason why somebody would ignore this error rate in determining a trajectory like the one in our case?
I don't know why anybody would ignore it. Any scientific endeavor has error associated. So even when I'm measuring, there's error built into it. So that's what we're trying to, with this type of graphic, be as accurate as possible.
If a trajectory was based on something that failed to incorporate this error rate, would it be accurate?
It potentially could be accurate. You hit the mark. You were accurate. But it is better practice to associate some error to a trajectory.
And so while even if you have a possibility of being accurate, you have many possibilities of being inaccurate.
You do.
Which is why you incorporate this error and have a trajectory cone which encompasses 99% of all potential
Well, this
results.
one we did not use uncertainty of measurement. There weren't a battery of measurements done. This is my interpretation of the defects in this trajectory to create this cone of error around it.
Now, in this case, did you extend this trajectory cone off into space for hundreds of feet?
I did not.
Do you normally do that?
Typically, we don't.
Why not?
Typically, a good example would be like a vehicle. I'll process a vehicle outside of the scene, and you would get a graphic back very similar to this with rods coming out of it, trajectories. And then it's put into the scene, and then that information is then compared to statements to see, yes, this person says they were here, they shot, and it makes sense to the trajectories that we're now witnessing in a car. So we don't try to develop the trajectories to fit scenarios. We just give the information of what the actual item has to offer.
And so, as we see this increasing size to the potential spot where the bullet originated from, as we go further away from the hole of the tree, is that correct?
That's correct.
What could make the trajectory analysis more specific in this case?
In regards to,
If we had more, let's say, points of entry or defects, would that have made it potentially more specific?
specific in a position?
More accurate?
More accurate, well, more accurate as far as this trajectory, or?
Yes, sir.
I don't think there's anything else we could have done to make it any more accurate on this particular trajectory. I can't give you any information about where the shooter was. I don't have that information. I can't predict that just with one line.
Hypothetically, if somebody were to take a string from this tree and then run it to another, what was the term that you used for something on the scene there? Article or?
Artifact?
Artifact. And run it to an artifact on somewhere in the crime scene. The fact that you just put a string from that tree to that artifact, does that necessarily prove a trajectory?
For a trajectory, you have to have 2 points. If I had been on this scene and I was looking at this tree and I saw the hole there and I couldn't get a rod into it, I couldn't take a string and tack it to the hole and then run the string out and try to figure out a position because I don't have a secondary hole. In order for that trajectory to work, you need 2 fixed points in space. If I were just to put a string at that hole, that's one single point. I can rotate that string in any position that I want. So that would be not an accurate way to do it.
And if you tried to base where that second string or point would be on contextual information from investigators on the scene or anybody else, would you now be affected and have that contextual bias potentially
Sure,
in determining that trajectory?
that would be information that I didn't know before that I know now.
And so from your expert opinion, that bullet originated from the southeast of that tree, correct?
That's correct.
And that cone increases in size as we get further and further out, whether it's going towards the highway, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you can't tell this jury the exact path of the bullet that struck that tree, can you?
I can't. That's just a limitation of the science.
And you can't tell this jury, based on that single strike in the tree, exactly where a shooter was standing when that bullet was fired, can you?
I cannot.
And you can't tell from any of this where Corey Jones may have been at any point.
I cannot.
Can you even say, through this analysis alone, whether or not Corey Jones was even alive when this shot was fired that struck this tree?
I don't have any information to that.
Just that the shot originated from the southeast.
That's all I can extrapolate based on the information that I have.
Can you even say from this trajectory that this bullet in this tree was fired from the gun of the defendant at Corey Jones?
I didn't do any comparison analysis with the bullet from this tree, so that was left up to the West Palm Beach laboratory.
If I may approach the clerk, Your Honor.
You may.
Can I have 82 and 83, please? First witness, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
These are what's been previously marked as 82 composite A and B and 83 composite A and B. Sir, can you look at these, please? And I'll go ahead and take 84. Thank you, sir. And are those just the same photos that we just saw in 84, sir?
They are, except there are some red arrows that I did not put on these, on this particular one, which is, I'm not sure which one this is, 82.
Thank you. Just, these are marked for identification purposes earlier, Your Honor. I'd ask to introduce, can I have this, please?
Yes.
82 and 83, both composites A and B, Your Honor.
With no objection, they are omitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And sir, after you concluded all of your analysis of the evidence that you were provided, did you then go ahead and appropriately return those back to the contributors in Palm Beach County?
I did.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Okay, so before we start cross, let's take a quick 5-minute break. Jurors, turn your pads upside down on your chairs. Don't talk about the case. Grab some coffee, snack, whatever you want. Let's make it a quick break. Mr. Smith, you can't talk to anybody about the case right now, but you're free to step down if you need to use the restroom.
Thank you, sir.
And lawyers, you do the same, and let's make it as quick as possible. 5 minutes.